Hey, Social Work 321 students, welcome to class, welcome to week 3. You have 2 chapters to read this week. I know that's a lot, but they're entertaining. There's some good stuff in there. Today I'm going to go over a lot of chapter 3 with you and maybe touch on chapter 4 a little bit. You do have a PowerPoint for chapter 4 in your module, so I wanted to focus a little bit more on chapter 3. One of the first areas I'd like to discuss is the 3 ideas of the process of critical thinking, scientific inquiry, and lifelong learning. So let's start with critical thinking. What is critical thinking? According to your textbook, it involves the propensity and skill to use reflective skepticism. I love that, reflective skepticism. So we don't take things as face value. If you are a critical thinker, you question your own judgment. You question everything. That's not a bad thing. Were you the kind of kid that asked why all the time? Good. So was I. Drove my parents crazy. But those of us who are inquisitive and who are skeptics are more likely to be critical thinkers. One of the things your textbook says is that this propensity to use reflective skepticism involves the careful examination and evaluation of belief and actions. So we examine things. We want to know what's behind everything, all right? We better understand things like cultural evolution, where people come from in their thinking, how societies are formed, and that kind of thing. We are lovers of learning. We're fascinated by how cultures evolve, how societies function, and how individuals within those societies can best be helped, because that's kind of our quest as social workers. Let's take an example. So let's say you have a child who you are working with in a professional arena as a social worker, whether it's as a school social worker or in family therapy or something to that effect. And the child makes a statement that makes you question whether or not there is some abuse going on within that household. If you use reflective skepticism, you are going to, dig, and you are going to recognize that at face value, you can't take everything as it seems. At the same time, one of the important aspects of dealing with children is validating what the emotion is underneath what they're saying. And if they were to unveil that there was some kind of abuse going on and you said, oh, that can't be true, then guess what? You're pulling the rug out from under that individual, and that can lead to even worse behavior later on. And so we do want to validate the emotion of what's going on with an individual at the same time using this idea of reflective skepticism, okay? Scientific inquiry. This involves making observations, posing questions, examining books and other sources of information to see what is already known. Scientific inquiry. There's a lot of people out there in the media, in the world in general, that don't value or acknowledge scientific inquiry as an important part of a process for a professional to take in making a judgment. But it is very, very important. There are all kinds of pseudosciences out there, especially in rural Nevada. Boy, we are full of pseudoscience. And I think it's really important that if you are a professional, if you're a social worker in an arena where you are valued because of the rigorous training you've received in your education and in your internship training, then you are the kind of person who is going to value scientific inquiry, and you're going to question pseudoscience, okay? It's very, very important. Lifelong learning, what's that about? The study of social work changes constantly. I find it really interesting right now with post-COVID. We're in a world where there's there's more thought processes and there's more talk that is familiar to those of us who've been in the social work profession. We understand the importance of diversity. We've been talking about that for years, and suddenly, everybody in the media is talking about valuing diversity and recognizing that it's not always just about equality, but it's also about making opportunities equal. And so, yeah, that's familiar. That's something that we're familiar with. And so social workers are valued more than ever. Part of that lifelong learning, as a professional social worker, to maintain your license, you will be required to have 30 continuing education hours every other year. And you have to submit those to the board or have them ready to be submitted in case you're audited. But and you're required to take a training on suicide prevention every year. That's something that is required for every single year. So that lifelong learning is really important. Cultures evolve and change, and with that is the thought processes, the ways that we use scientific inquiry to make sure we're on track. So we attend these trainings. We have a better understanding now of things like autism than we did, 5, 10, definitely even, a year ago. We have a better understanding. And as we have evolved because of COVID, there's been so many changes that have happened. There's been an increased sense of stress among individuals. So there's more need for professional mental health care workers. Let's go through. I am on page 51 of your textbook. I think that something that's really important to recognize is that knowledge alone does not necessarily lead to good decisions, okay? Social workers need to question, and I love these 3 things, the validity, the reliability, and the relevance of information that might guide the nature and quality of our service. So first of all, the validity. Is what I see going on here valid? Let's say, for example, you are a family advocate, and one of your duties as a social worker is you're required to go into family homes where there has been accusation of some kind of neglect or abuse going on. Let's say you walk into a trailer and it's chaos. There's clothes and toys and papers everywhere. And maybe you come from an upbringing where your mother was a meticulous homemaker and everything was just looky-ploo at your house. You had to make your bed every morning. So it could be that your first instinct is, oh yeah, there's neglect going on here. Is that a valid assumption, right? Knowledge alone doesn't always necessarily lead to good decisions. Because if you look a little deeper, you might recognize that that is not valid. Is that thought process reliable? Well, not everybody has the same standards of clean, but they may or may not be abusing or neglecting children in an environment like that. And perhaps if you looked a little closer, you'd recognize that what you initially thought was filth is actually clutter. And here's a family that is very active in art projects and spending time with their children, but they don't really care about the mess. But the kids are fed and bathed and clothed, and their needs are met, and they don't have scars or bruises and that kind of thing going on. So the relevance of the information, is it relevant? At the same time, you could go into a situation like that and you could initially think that there is abuse or neglect going on, and then as you look further, you could be, soothed into believing that there's not, when in fact there is. And, the reverse can be true too. You could go into a pristine environment and there could be horrific abuse going on. So knowledge alone doesn't necessarily lead to good decisions. We need to question. The certainty that our thoughts are true is not indicative of the truth of those thoughts. We can be 100% sure and 100% wrong. Yeah. So I think one of the things that I was taught early on in my practicum training in graduate school is listen to your gut. What is your gut telling you? Confidence is a feeling, one determined mostly by the coherence of the story and by the ease with which it comes to mind, even when the evidence for the story is sparse and unreliable. An individual who expresses high confidence probably has a good story, which may or may not be true. So we don't always look at someone with confidence and feel like there's not guilt as well, because boy, narcissists can really throw you off. And there's a lot of people that you may work with who are very guilty on many, many levels, and feel like they can pull the wool over your eyes. So you need to be inquisitive. You need to use the scientific inquiry. Social workers realize that our ideas, beliefs, or judgments are subject to error. And I think that's a really important concept. Just because you will have had a ton of education and a lot of hands-on training doesn't mean that your judgment is always exact, right? It's good to bring colleagues in sometimes and have other heads, have other people's ideas and interpretations of a situation. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the 4 different categories of development. This is Perry's model of intellectual development. May or may not be on your test, but Perry suggested that during their educational experience, college students tend to adopt positions within 4 categories of intellectual development. And those 4 categories are 1, dualism, 2, multiplicity, 3, contextual relativism, and 4, committed relativism. So let's start out with dualistic thinkers. These are those that often assume that absolute truth exists, okay? There's kind of a true or false, a right or wrong, and they have a hard time seeing anything gray. Behavior is either right or wrong. There's nothing in the middle. And many issues and situations are complex, dynamic. In a professional social work setting, you are not always going to have a cut and dried situation. For example, let's say you're working with a family in which there are gambling addiction. There's gambling addiction going on. Let's say you have a grandmother raising her grandchildren and has an addiction to gambling. Yeah, what's your knee-jerk reaction to that? You know, a lot of my students early on are like, yeah, let's pull the kid out. and that seems to be the answer to any potentially abusive situation. Let's pull the kid out. Now, the situation that I'm talking about, perhaps the grandmother is spending money at the casino that could be spent for food, clothing, education, that kind of thing for her grandkids. What happens if children are pulled out? Well, they go into foster homes. Are there an abundance of foster parents ready to accept children? No, not really. Not really. It's not always the best case scenario. So we really need to think long and hard before we pull a child out of a situation. And perhaps that grandmother has so much stress, and this is one of her coping mechanisms, is to go to a casino and slap down $100 and, you know, whatever. So maybe a better solution than pulling the children out would be meeting with that grandmother and providing some cognitive behavioral therapy that can help her overcome this addictive behavior. All right. The second one, multiplistic thinkers. These are the kind of people that often make claims based upon assumptions that perspectives cannot and perhaps should not be judged by others or by external standards. So this attitude is everyone has a right to his or her point of view. Okay. When making claims, multiplistic thinkers may provide support in the form of statements such as, that's my view, and I have a right to my opinion, and you have a right to yours. The problem is with this kind of thinking is that opinions, positions, claims, and arguments are not all equally valid, reasonable, or relevant. For example, notions of race or national superiority, okay? Some of these ideas can contribute to suffering. and we don't want that going on. So a dualistic thinker may know absolutely what is right and wrong and can readily take action based on that kind of thinking. But a multiplistic thinker may be unable to assess various positions from a rational or scientific perspective, and as a result may become indecisive and passive. So a dualistic thinker says, this is how it is, and a multiplistic thinker is like, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how it is. This passivity and indecision in the face of complex and competing viewpoints, especially when horrendous crimes against humanity occur. One of the famous quotes in your textbook is, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing. And that is by Edmund Burke. And so that's multiplistic thinking, isn't it? To just sit back and say, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Everybody has a different perspective. And one of the ways I've seen that in my practice as a social worker is people from other cultures who have assured me, when I owned my domestic violence agency, I worked with people from cultures outside of my own that assured me that there was nothing wrong with beating your spouse because that's what was done in their culture, and that was the way things were for hundreds of years, and it wasn't going to change. Well, you know, if the law's being broken and if someone is being violated and physically abused, guess what? They are required to answer for that, and a stand has to be taken. All right. Contextually relativistic thinkers, these are those that have, they realize that different points of view or frames of reference may, in terms of their value or utility, vis-a-vis the situation or circumstance. In other words, this is the person in environment perspective. We recognize that people make decisions based on, a lot of times based on the society around them. And so situational thinkers are often, they find it extremely difficult and sometimes frightening to make a final decision and a firm commitment because they seek to understand and empathize. They find value in the experiences and viewpoints of people from various cultures and circumstances. So they take into account where somebody is coming from. An example in my experience as a social worker would include my time in the inner city of Las Vegas, in which I facilitated a teen treatment program. And many of these girls had found prostitution to be very appealing. Why? They really saw themselves as things. These are girls between the ages of 14 and 18 who had been convicted of some kind of a, crime, but were too young to go to jail, so they were in a house arrest. And it was a privilege for them to come to my classes, in which we talked about all kinds of topics. But that was really interesting how many of them had this kind of skewed perspective of right and wrong. Being a prostitute brought funds that they would never have access to otherwise. It brought power, personal power, to these girls. And so, one of the things, how do you combat a whole state that has this, a whole city, at least in the state, that says what happens here stays here? You can come from anywhere around the world to Las Vegas and do stuff here that you wouldn't do in your own hometown. And guess what? What happens here spills out and pours over to the youth of this community. And I think that's a horrific ad. But that's the idea behind contextually relevant thinkers, okay? I'm not going to look at those teenage girls and say, you are the scum of the earth, because they're not. They've been raised in an environment where they were taught that what they looked like was more valuable than what was going on in their head, that what they could do to bring a man pleasure was more important than getting an education, okay? And so these were the values that they were surrounded by, and yeah, pretty sad situation. But that, I think that's kind of the best example. So sorry, it's pretty graphic, but that's the reality of being a social worker. You deal with those kind of things. Okay, the last one, committed relativistic thinkers. These are the professionals who adopt a general philosophy with a set of values or guiding principles through which to approach life and consider various points of view. So committed thinkers reflect a coherent identity and a tangible sense of self. Well-conceived values and principles complement multiplistic and situational thinking and contribute to the development of logical, coherent positions on complex issues. Yeah, that's a mouthful. So here's an example. A committed thinker might assign greater value to the principles of honor, integrity, human rights, and social justice than to those of personal security and safety. Yeah. Obviously, that's the kind of thinker we want to be. We want to have a good set of tools in our proverbial tool chest, which we can use. And part of those tools include understanding, education. The more you guys read and learn, the more you are likely to become committed relativistic thinkers. All right, let's talk a little bit about affirmative action. Yeah, okay. We live in a time, by the way, it's February, it's Black History Month, and I have actually been in a situation where I've seen affirmative action make a huge difference in the lives of families that I've worked with. I worked with one single mom, African-American mom in East Cleveland, who was able to get into medical school and get an education to provide for her family because of affirmative action. It can be a very positive thing. One of the concepts that you will learn about in your textbook is this idea of ultimate attribution error, where we blame undesirable people for the miserable conditions in which they exist and victims for the crimes committed against them. And you've probably all seen examples of this in your life. Ultimate attribution error is something that happened in pre-World War II Germany, in which children were taught through math problems that Jews were horrific people and that they should be done away with. In the book Sense and Sensibility, if you're a Jane Austen fan, this is a situation. There was a situation in this book in which the big brother, who had been left a ton of money, but the sisters hadn't been left any money, and on the father's deathbed, he asked the big brother, who was the half brother of the sisters, if he would help the daughters of this man. And he said that he would, but then his conniving wife talked him out of it, saying, they don't need much because they aren't going to have much. And so why should we give them money? They're not even going to have servants or a carriage or these kind of things. So why should we give them money to help them? Because they're going to be so poor that they don't need. That's kind of the mentality that happens when we have ultimate attribution error going on. Good definition to understand. Call me, text me, email me, let me know if you have any questions or concerns about this week's assignments, and I hope you learned something in today's lecture. This is a really good textbook. Go over those chapters again. Remember that there's kind of a review at the beginning and the end of these chapters, which can be really helpful. I know that many of you, you're taking a lot of courses, you're working full-time, you've got families, you've got commitments that can be hairy, which is part of the reason I'm doing these lectures, to kind of help you be familiar with some of the ideas in the book. watch my lectures while you're getting ready in the morning or doing the dishes or whatever. And hopefully this will help you get through some of the, rigor of these classes. And I appreciate being able to work with you, and please don't hesitate to call me. I'm here for you.